Hello and welcome. Today I have another special guest, Dr. Tracy Packiam Alloway, who is a psychologist, professor, and author and TEDx speaker. I'm very pleased to have her today for my Building Successful Lives audience. She has published 15 books and over 100 scientific articles on the brain and memory. She has also provided consultancy to the World Bank on reading in developing countries and is a sought after international speaker. Her research has also been featured on BBC, Good Morning America, The Today Show, Forbes, Bloomberg, The Washington Post, Newsweek, and many other outlets. She has also been featured as an expert in the documentary The Observed Life. And Dr. Tracy Packiam Alloway has done extensive research in memory. And as a speech language pathologist, lots of the students that I work with have auditory memory and language memory difficulties and so forth. So I invited her on today just to talk about equity in the field of special education and also different things regards to memory. And we're going to delve into that topic. And it's always nice to just have varied perspectives, diverse perspectives on various topics as it relates to children with special needs. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you.
I know the folks that listen to my website and read my blog are going to be interested to hear about these topics. I want you to please kindly explain what are the different types of memory, first and
That's
foremost.
a great question. Yeah. And so I think most people are probably familiar with short-term memory, which is the kind of memory that you just hold for a few seconds. So when someone tells you their name or, a little small snippet of information, that's your short-term memory that's working. Most of us are probably also familiar with long-term memory, and that's the memory that we store in a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And that relates to everything from childhood memories, your best friend's name from first grade, special events from your childhood, maybe your graduation day, a really important birthday party that you really enjoyed. And that's all part of long-term memory. My area of research expertise looks at kind of that midway between short-term and long-term memory, and it's called working memory. And you can think of working memory as your active memory. It's the memory that you're using actively at the moment. So when someone tells you their name and their job title, your working memory kicks into gear and says, oh, I have to remember them because they just said they're a realtor and I'm looking to buy a house and I want to remember that bit of information. So that working memory is almost like the glue between what you're hearing at the moment and information you want to move to your long-term memory to store for later.
Yes, and I know lots of children and adults struggle with the working memory. So what is the impact of all those working memory, short-term memory, auditory memory on children with language impairments and or learning disabilities and autism? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, that is a great question. So actually my research expertise started from looking at government funded projects specifically at the role of memory in learning, working memory specifically in learning. And for me, I was so excited to find that working memory is almost like an equalizer. We had this huge government funded study, children from all different backgrounds, all different schools, parents with different educational levels. And the one thing that I found is that regardless of the parents' educational background, the child themselves wasn't being disadvantaged for what their working memory capacity or their space was. So it was almost like, I call it an equalizer. It levels the playing field where we know that other traditional cognitive measures like IQ, verbal IQ especially, are very sensitive to nuances and socioeconomic factors and how many books you were read to as a child, what your parents' educational level is. But we found that, both my own research coming out of my lab, colleagues around the world. I've done multiple cross-cultural studies. I've done multiple studies where we look at different economic backgrounds too, both in children and adults. And we find that it's working memory that tends to be somewhat uniform, if you will, across the board. So in other words, we don't see these huge variations as a result of, again, your parents' educational level, where you're growing up, whether you went to the library and had access to these opportunities. So when it comes to learning needs specifically, I think the role of working memory is also very interesting. First of all, one of the big parts of my research paradigm was to understand that memory is not just this one big, blob of how we use our brain. But actually it's quite nuanced in that we have auditory memory, as you just mentioned, so information that we receive through our ears, through what we hear. And we also have visual memory, the memory that we see. And we know with specific learning needs types, and again, I've done multiple studies on this, both government funded, both working directly with clinicians like yourselves, where we see that depending on the learning need, whether it's ADHD, language impairments, autism, motor difficulties like developmental coordination disorder, that profile of memory is unique. So we can't just say, oh, just because we're working with a student with language impairments, they must have a memory deficit. We find that it's not as easy or not as simple as that. And in fact, they may have memory deficits, but they also have memory strengths. And that's what motivated me to write these children's book series a couple years ago, where it's called Special Needs Superpowers, where I focus on the memory superpowers. So if you think of a child with autism, again, there's a lot of variability because, as we know, autism is a spectrum. So their memory capacities also range. So in some cases, you have individuals with on the spectrum that have above average memory, and in other cases, their auditory memory may look just like a student with language impairments. And if you're looking just at verbal memory, it's hard to distinguish between the two types of learning needs. Another thing that I found specific to autism is that some children on the spectrum have visual memory deficits, especially when they're younger. And I found that this is potentially linked to how they learn social skills. So if you think about it, a large part of our communication is nonverbal. And if you have a visual memory impairment, that may make it more challenging to interpret, hey, when they frown a little bit, or when they move their shoulders away from me when they're talking, it means that they don't want to play anymore. They don't like the way the game is going. And if their visual memory is impaired, it may be harder for them to kind of catalog and remember these specific nonverbal instances that can kind of add to the challenges of social interaction.
Yes, I know children with autism or autistic children definitely have some memory issues with the visual processing and the visual memory, and that can play into how they interact socially. In addition to children with learning disabilities, sometimes they have the auditory memory difficulties, and then sometimes it's really attention. I know you deal a lot with children with attention, but I have found in my observations too, sometimes the children with learning disabilities or language disorders, they may have some memory challenges, but in addition, it's attention. So what is it? Is it the attention why they can't remember, or is it the memory why they are having trouble attending? Sometimes, what do you think? Do you think there's some overlap?
That's a great question.
The attention?
Yeah, that is a great question. And sometimes I say that to adults, they'll say, oh, I never remember people's names. I have a bad memory. But then you hear them recite all of these pieces of information, maybe about baseball or football, if that's what they're interested in, or a recipe that it was their grandmother's. And you just think, well, how do you know all of this information? But you just told me that you have a bad memory. And attention is certainly one of that. We know there's a lot of research that there's two parts to the memory process. One is encoding, which is getting the information in. So if you have a student that is not interested in the lesson for whatever reason, maybe they're disengaged because of the classroom, their peers, the teacher themselves, whatever the reason. So if they're not engaged, their attention isn't there to get the information in to begin with. So it may not be a memory problem, like you mentioned, Tamara. It could just be an attention problem of getting it into the memory. And then the second part of the memory process is the retrieval. We may forget those little cues that we use. So it's almost like, wait, where did I leave that piece of paper? And our memory system works similar to that. We have little, mental spaces for that. We almost have to track down, oh, where was I when I heard that piece of information? What was I doing? Maybe even what was I wearing? How was I feeling? And all those are great quick cues to kind of trigger your memory into retrieving that information. And so that's why, as a licensed psychologist, when I do work with students with special needs, I try to look at both the memory profile uniquely. And so we look at memory with information that is not linked to semantic, that has no semantic connection. So letters, images that don't resonate, they're not supposed to be highly familiar, because obviously we know the more familiar something is, the easier it is for us to remember that. So we try to create a baseline for their memory. And I also look at attention. I look at things like sustained attention, selective attention. So like you indicated, we want to be able to dissociate the attention issues from a potential memory issue.
Yes, definitely. I know there's definitely some overlap in some cases, but not always, but it's just good to consider. Can you kindly describe some ways that speech pathologists, teachers, and parents can assist children with special needs improving their memory skills? Or is it
Yeah.
possible to improve memory?
That is a great question. And 10 years ago, if someone had posed that question about improving memory, the results were not so optimistic. It was thought that, well, it's almost like height. If you're stuck with this height, well, this is it. But now we know that that there's a certain plasticity to our memory. And regardless of your age, there's studies done with children, my own research, other researchers have looked at even the other end of the lifespan, people over 65, and found that at any age, you can show huge improvements in memory. And so I actually have an app that's available both on the Google Store and the Apple Store. It's called the Alloway Working Memory Assessment. And so it's based on standardized scientific norms of, first of all, to indicate what your memory profile looks like for your age. So if you're a 10-year-old, you'll be compared with other 10-year-olds. If you're in your 30s, you're being compared with other individuals in their 30s. But another portion of that are memory tips. So you have 50 tips, all based on science. So a quick one is the parent. If you want to change the eating habits of your child, even adding 2 tablespoons of blueberry juice has been found to improve working memory over a few weeks. And so sometimes when I give longer presentations and professional development days, especially to schools, I try to split up the memory tips into what I call slow acting. So it takes a few weeks before you begin to see those changes. Things like blueberries or flavonoid-rich foods. Dark chocolate is another fun one, especially for kids. If the Easter Bunny came and you're stuck with a lot of chocolate, as long as it's dark chocolate, that's found to be rich in flavonoids. And studies show that it can also improve working memory for up to 2 hours after consuming the dark chocolate. And then I have a medium acting where, sometimes it takes 20 minutes and you can see improvements to working memory. My own research, I've looked at things like drawing. And drawing uses a lot of working memory because you have that planning where you have to think of what it is that you want to draw. You have inhibition. You have to put aside things that are not relevant to what you want to create and all of that. Other things like running, to even 16 minutes of running. And there's studies done with children to show that a quick running improves both attention and working memory, in part because it's improving blood flow to your prefrontal cortex. And then I have the fast acting. If you, as a parent, you're like, I need something right now. I can't even wait the 20 minutes. Studies show that essential oils like rosemary and peppermint work with a memory neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And that can actually activate acetylcholine, that memory neurotransmitter, and make it easier. So if your child has to study, or if you're working with a child in a one-on-one setting as a therapist or clinician, and you just want them to focus a little bit more, I know some practitioners will have a diffuser with that peppermint or rosemary going on in the background to kind of help activate that acetylcholine.
Those are some very interesting tips and some different tips. And I like how you integrated the movements, how the exercise and running. That's something they can do outside of speech language therapy or special education classroom, but it can something that can have some good effects for them. I know in the school setting and private therapy, we may have, teach the kids different mnemonics or different short things to work on their short-term memory or immediate memory, such as, try to remember 3 items if you're going to the grocery list, just kind of rehearsal and chunking, those types of memory strategies. We tend to do a lot of those in the education setting. So it's nice and kind of a little refreshing to see we can eat chocolate and blueberries.
I love those tips too.
It might be, longer acting, but that's just some things that the families can integrate into their different daily lives. And I like the movement, like you said, the movement, get out and move. Activity is so good for the brain in so many various ways. And there's some tips. How can professionals ensure that children and adolescents receive tailored and equitable interventions that truly lead to measurable and lifelong gains, especially in special education classrooms? I know sometimes in the RTI process, MTSS, we see a kid with learning disabilities, attention, all these things, but how can we really make it equitable for children?
That is such a great question. It has really been a big focus in my own research program. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to move away from memory as a single generalized idea. I wanted to really explore, well, how do we use our memory in learning, and how can we measure our memory? So I think the first step is to understand that you have an auditory memory and a visual memory, just at least from an educational perspective. And so sometimes teachers will say, well, I keep telling them the same information, but they're just not listening. And it could be that that auditory memory is an area of weakness, a challenge for them. And so it's almost like saying to the child, well, just, hop on that right ankle that's hurt right now, just to strengthen it. And so maybe we want to use a more scaffolding approach where if their visual memory is relatively stronger, then we can give them a lot of visual prompts, written prompts to work with them there. So I think that first step is really understand what their memory profile looks like, first of all, where their strengths and difficulties lie. And then we can work accordingly to tailor, if you are using mnemonics, do you want that to be visual or verbal? Again, tailored towards that memory profile of the student you're working with.
Yes, I think that's very important. I think sometimes in the school system and other settings, that memory piece gets missed. But I know just from being at lots of meetings and listening to psychological reports and certain things, I have to advocate sometimes, let's look into the memory. I know the psychologists do a wonderful job with their assessments and so forth, but we have to make sure that they're comprehensive, because a lot of times I have just seen in my observations, a good percentage of the children with language disorders and learning disabilities, they also have that working memory deficit or auditory memory or language memory. We see that overlap. So it's making sure that they get the tailored interventions, like you say, to really address whatever the type of memory deficit, and to know that for special education teachers and parents and so forth, to know that memory can be something that they can improve, because memory is needed for everything in learning. So my students, they have to listen, speak, think, learn to read and write, but thinking and that metalinguistic skills is so important.
Yes.
And memory is needed for metalinguistic things, to think about what they're learning, right? Active thinking and active engagement,
I think that's such a key piece, and sometimes we forget to mention that, or we overlook that whole metacognition or meta-awareness. And so, I've worked with college students as well as with grade school students, elementary students, and one of the big things I try to encourage them is to say, hey, when you remember this, stop. What did you do to remember it? Can you use it again in the next instance? So really helping them develop some agency, some autonomy in their learning process, so they can say, hey, I did this right. What did I do? And, rather than just saying, oh, I just did it, or, really helping them introspect a little bit in their own learning process.
Yes, and I think it's important for children, elementary school age and middle and high school, to really have that buy-in into therapy, if it's speech language therapy, or if they're getting specialized instruction, because when they know that they really truly play an active role, they're just not sitting there being passive learners, because how could you learn if you're truly just passive, right? It's an active, it should be, not for all children, it really should be actively. If they're not engaged, then we have to work on the engagement piece, but it should be an active, learning is an active process, right?
Yeah.
So we have to make sure that when they're engaging, they're focused and attentive, and then they can really glean whatever strategies and so forth, and that you're teaching them. So
and that goes back to that attention piece that you mentioned in the beginning. If they aren't engaged, they're not going to focus their attention, which means they're not going to encode that information to begin with.
Yes. I know I try to incorporate a lot of memory strategies. I work on listening comprehension a lot. A lot of children with learning disabilities and autism, when they get to a certain point, I remove a lot of the prompts and the cues and the visual aids. I know sometimes the kids, autistic children, can get so prompt dependent and so cue dependent and pictorial cues. So I remove that and have them work on just strictly the auditory a lot of times. Right. When I'm doing literacy-based therapy and different things. And I find when I do that, I remove the picture prompts and all of that. They really hone in, they work on their listening comprehension. And while they're working on listening, right, at the same time, they're working on memory. So I have found over the years for that to be, very successful with remediating language disorders and the memory over the years.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful to hear.
And I know with working with the kids with the phonological awareness and all that thing, a lot of those types of activities are also active listening activities, and you're working on the language memory, auditory memory. So
that's right.
The activities that I do in my practice really, it's connected, right? It's connected. So I've seen the evidence. So it's nice for you to share that the research is now supporting that. Yes, we can work on memory. It's not just
which is something you've been doing all along.
To some degree. What do you believe are some success keys for children and adolescents to excel academically, socially, and emotionally?
What do I believe? I'm sorry, say again.
What do you believe are some success keys for children and adolescents as holistically to excel academically, socially, and emotionally, whether it's in the school setting, public school, private school?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that goes back to when we're talking about meta awareness. I think it's important for them. And I've seen even young children able to do this, even let's say we're talking about phonological skills. You're working with a kindergartner and identifying initial letter sounds, b for boy, b for bat. When they get it right, you can stop and ask them, what did you do to get that right? What were you thinking of? Did you have a song? Did you have a sound? Did you have, and really encouraging them to stop and introspect and say, oh, I did this. And I think that that skill of self-directed learning or self-awareness of their learning will carry them through. It's a generalizable skill. I just recently finished a study with college students, and I found that the students who have their own metacognitive skills tend to be more successful. They tend to use strategies that are more what we call elaborative. They're more deeper processing of information rather than that shallow processing. Oh, I'm just going to skim the chapter and hopefully it'll all get in my head. So I think that first of all, that awareness of what am I doing when I get it correct? And conversely, when I didn't get it correct, what strategy can I use here? Did Miss show me this, or did Mr. show me this that I can now put into practice that I forgot to use? So recognizing even what's in their toolbox to pull out on their own. And I think that is, keeping it simple, just that one key is something that they can carry through their whole educational career. And, I've worked with kindergartners. I'm a college professor, so I work with that end right now too. And I see that the students that aren't aware of their own learning strengths, how they're able to learn well, they're the ones that end up struggling by the end of the semester, saying, oh, I didn't know how to study for this. But I think if you give them this really important key, as you mentioned, which is simply to stop and say, what did I do? Can I do it again? And, do I need to tweak it a little bit for the next time I do this? Will really help them as a learner.
Yes, and I think I love that, letting kids know that they can have ownership, whether they're in kindergarten or 6th grade, 11th grade, or a college student as well, that they can have that metacognitive ability to really work through that, whatever they're learning, to think about their learning. I think that is very key for them to succeed. Do you have any tips for them, kids nowadays with COVID going on and so many different things, to work on their social emotional skills? I know in the school system, that's something that's very important, and privately, just to make sure for their overall wellness. Any wellness tips for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is a great question. And I think, I've done a lot of research on mental health too, more generally speaking. One of the big things is to be able to switch your mindset to one of gratitude. So oftentimes it's easy to think, and especially as a teenager, sometimes your world is immediate. It's incredibly present. And I've, also done research where we find that optimism. So when I've done lifespan studies from kids as young as 5 up to 79, 80 years of age, we find that optimism levels are the lowest in teenage years and in our 60s. And in part because if you think of that time of our life, we're in high school about to graduate, so the future's uncertain. So it's hard to be optimistic. We don't know what's coming up. And equally in our 60s, that's retirement age. Again, we don't know what's kind of around the bend, and which is a little bit of what COVID is like. We don't know what's around the bend. We're kind of very in the present moment, and sometimes to a fault. And I think at this point, it's important. Scientists or researchers call this learned optimism, that we recognize that our language center controls our optimism bias. And so starting the day with the positive, or ending the day, if you're a night owl or morning bird, whichever way you want to do it, but really being intentional in looking for things that you're grateful and optimistic about. So instead of saying, I miss my friend's birthday party, or, we can't get together again and do all the fun things. We can't go bowling as a group. Yes, and so even changing that one word instead of yes, but yes, and I get to Zoom friends in another state that I wouldn't usually chat with, or yes, and we actually get to cook dinner via Zoom together, or whatever that, silver lining might be, that you can retrain your brain to focus on something that you can be grateful or thankful for, can make a huge difference to your mental health.
I think it's very important. Look for the silver lining in gratitude. I think gratitude is just so important. That's something I have practiced for a while. And I think for kids, it's something to keep them motivated. And the children and families that I work with, I say, keep them in the hobbies, and there's some areas, if it's safe for them to go back to sports like soccer or baseball, it's good. And if you have to wait, then they can find different ways to Zoom with their friends, Zoom birthday parties, or if they can do a social distance outing, outside. I like to get outdoors. I know you love to get outdoors as well. Walks and different runs. I'm not a runner, but get outside and do a little activity. So I think that's important for their social and emotional well-being. And can you just share some more about what resources do you have for speech language pathologists and teachers to maximize the learning achievement of diverse learners? I know you have extensive resources, but you can name a couple.
Yes. Yeah, so I have a number of books, some specific for educators and parents published by Sage, where I look specifically at working memory. And a couple of the books actually have chapters geared for each learning need. So if you are working with a student with ADHD, first of all, what their memory profile looks like, and then second of all, tips that are tailored to that learning need. If you're working with a student with reading difficulties or language impairments, what does the typical memory profile look like? And I also break it down by age. So if you're working with early years, elementary or high school students, what that profile looks like across the educational lifespan, and ultimately what strategies are going to target that memory profile. So those are some of the resources. They're available on Amazon. You can find them on my website too. And for the children, I mentioned this a little bit earlier in this session with you. I have books more for the K through second graders where I look at their memory superpowers. So if you are either a parent or a clinician working with this population, and one of the things that I see in my clinic is, parents come to me crying and they say, I wish their friends would understand why Jimmy just wants to play with the pet turtle over lunch. He doesn't want to play with them. And, again, that's what motivated me to write these books is twofold. One, I wanted to celebrate their strengths. What are their memory superpowers? And second of all, I wanted to create awareness among their peers. Then they could say, wow, I didn't know this about Susie or Bobby, or this is so cool that they can do this. We only were focusing on this part of their challenges, not seeing the kind of big picture. So there's that. I also have a memory book for middle school kids where, again, I have a voice in the child's perspective where, what is it like to be a middle schooler struggling a little bit with memory, and ultimately what tips can a child put into practice themselves? Movement is one of them. Different things that are fun to eat that we talked about, like blueberries and dark chocolate or others. But again, I wanted resources for children to kind of take on board and feel excited that, hey, I can do this. This is what this is what I'm going through, and identify and feel excited about that too.
I love the practical tips that you have, things that kids can do to improve their memory skills and eating blueberries and chocolate. I think a lot of children and families will star that one at top. So I will definitely list those resources on my blog and website so that children and families can access them, and other speech therapists to share with the children and families that they work with as well. And I know another topic that has just been very important these days is diversity, and considering children and families with different cultural backgrounds and so forth. Do you have any tips for practitioners just to make sure that we're being culturally responsive and respectful when working with children from various backgrounds? I know you live in the UK and here in the United States. Just wanted some good tips that you have to be culturally responsive and respectful of people from various backgrounds and so forth.
Yeah, I think active listening is always a great starting point. As you mentioned, I was born in Malaysia, my family moved to the US, I moved to the UK and back to the US. So I used to live in Central America too for a couple of years. So I've had a chance to enjoy and appreciate a lot of different backgrounds and cultures. One of the things, as I mentioned early on with you too, I'm excited that Working Memory is culture fair, that, we've compared working memory profiles with students in South Africa, students in Asian countries, North America, various European countries. We've looked at immigrant populations as well as native speakers and compared differences there. And we find that if you are working with the child in the language in which they're comfortable with, in their own mother tongue, that is a good representation of what their memory performance is like. And so, as a practitioner, the first step is, if you are looking at memory as a gateway to know what they're able to learn, I would really stress the importance of assessing them in their own language. We've seen, one example is I was working with colleagues in the Netherlands. So Dutch is the native language there. And they were working with the Turkish population, and they used my assessment tool, which at the time was published by Pearson. And they tested their memory in Dutch, which was a second language for these populations, and then Turkish, which was their mother tongue. And they found huge differences in their working memory, which really drove home the point that if you're trying to say that this child has a need or is unable to do something, it's important to know what their ability is, because then again, you can distinguish between, is it a language need that we need to address, or is it a more underlying cognitive need that we need to address first? And I think so, if you are working with diverse populations or multilingual, bilingual students, it's really important to make sure that assessment is done in a language that they are comfortable with, they're familiar with. That would be, my first suggestion.
I think that's very important. I know here in Atlanta, we have children and families from all different, various countries, different backgrounds and so forth. And I know sometimes, it is very important to make sure that the evaluation is done in the primary language. And then sometimes we may have we have, Hispanic families, that's a very prevalent first native language for a lot of families, and Vietnamese. And sometimes we can have an interpreter come in and help with those assessments, but sometimes you just have to use different clinical judgment, and use the best resources that you have. But it's just important to consider. And that memory is something that, regardless of how many languages they speak, that memory is a deficit that can be found throughout, right? And we have to make sure that they're tailoring the correct intervention tailored to what the child and family's needs are. So I think that's really important, So it was just a nice little introduction for those that listen to my my literacy channel on my YouTube, and also read my website. And I'm definitely will list your website so they can gather lots of additional information from you and all of your books and your wonderful resources that you have. And I'm just so honored to have you just share a little snippet today, a little introduction for those who are not familiar with you. I know quite a few are, but just that they can get at some of the resources. And I know a lot of times as clinicians, we may, work on certain skills, but we need to make sure that memory is something that we're also addressing, right? That memory, that the research on that has evolved over the last 5-10 years. So we need to make sure that in therapy that we're providing some of those types of memory type strategies with our speech and language therapy sessions and special education teachers, and then things that parents can do at home as well. So it's just lovely to have you on today, just to share some information to the folks that listen to the website and so forth.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a wonderful afternoon spending it talking with you.
Yes, thank you so much.